everybody, welcome to number 27 and to what is not really the kind of car that you would normally expect to see on the channel. You might be a bit baffled as to why I am driving this today. Well, as you all know, I do love my Italian cars, and I'm also interested in what has happened to Fiat in the last 20 to 30 years, because they seem to have hit a terminal decline. And this car, the Tipo, has not really been a great success. But James, who bought this, had an absolute bargain, and I just couldn't resist but to drive it and see, is it really as bad as everyone says, or is this actually the bargain of the century? Also to find out a little bit more about the background, because it is quite interesting. So Fiat, since the 80s, have been trying to crack the Golf sector, and they never quite managed it. It was the holy grail for a long time. Now, of course, with the sort of SUV boom and so on, even this is beginning to drop off. But they had a good go with the original Tipo. They had a tried and trusted formula for an Italian car at the time, which was make it roomy, make it cheap, give it a bit of sort of pizzazz, and then see how you'll do. And at least in some markets, the original Tipo was quite successful. It was very different from any of the other offerings. I think it had more room than any other car in the class, and generally speaking, it was a pretty good car. It didn't quite hit the mark in terms of quality, but it wasn't a complete failure. For years, Fiat's had a reputation that they had a bit of a something extra, a bit of pizzazz, that they were fun to drive. But what they had on that side in driver involvement, they seemed to miss out in terms of reliability and in terms of quality. So in 2015, when Fiat made this, the new generation Tipo, they decided first of all to aim it as a kind of world car for developing countries. But rather than use the original formula of making a car that was fun to drive but maybe lacking in some of the fundamentals, they went the other way. So this Tipo does everything that you would want it to do. It doesn't look completely crazy like some of the original multiplers, for example. It drives fairly well. It's got plenty of room, and it's very, very economical to buy. Indeed, James bought this car in 2020 for just £9,500 new. So you could buy a Focus at the time second-hand, and it would be sort of £3,000 to £4,000 more. The same for an Astra. And a new Dacia, something like that, would have been sort of £4,000 to £5,000 more. Not only that, it was cheaper than the cheapest Fiat 500 in the showroom. An incredible, then, amount of value. The road tests, though, weren't particularly flattering. It seems that Fiat gave everybody what they wanted. They gave them a car which supposedly is quite reliable, it's reasonably well built, it is economical, and then nobody bought it. One of the things that they mentioned is that they're just dynamically not as exciting to drive as an Italian car should be, and even at this stage, not as exciting to drive as a Focus or a Vauxhall. So I'm going to give you my take on that in a moment, but it does seem that Fiat just can't win. You know, do what you're being asked, and still the car turns out to be a bit of a flop. Overall, I think that they've sold about 800,000 since 2015. There are some newer versions now. The latest one is a mild hybrid. Also, they criticised the looks. They said that the looks weren't quite good. I don't get that. I think it's quite a handsome car. This is the 3-box, the saloon. From the back, it doesn't look brilliant, maybe, but the Golf version one, the unbooted, the hatchback, I think looked pretty good. This looks good from the front and from the 3/4. And also BMW makes some hideous cars, and it's never stopped them selling. So let's find out what it's like dynamically and whether those reviews were right. So first of all, it's only a 1.4 95 horsepower, so it's not going to have a huge amount of poke. But it's not too bad, especially the mid-range between 3 and 4. It pulls quite nicely for what it is. The thing is, though, between 5 and 6, it becomes quite rough, which is not very characteristic for an Italian engine. They're supposed to want you to sort of completely grab them from the scruff of the neck and ring them through. I think that's what made cheap Italian cars so fun back in the day, and this really at 5,000 is not nice. But the chassis is fairly competent, so for a non-GTI it doesn't particularly lean in the corners. It's quite impressive really. The ride seems to be pretty good. I think another problem though is the steering. So it's got this very artificial feel from the straight ahead. It's almost as if it's trying to, it's got a very strong self-centering, but that doesn't feel natural. So as a result, it's not quite as happy to turn into corners as you would hope. To me, it seems very competent, and you know, it handles reasonably well. It's got good enough grip. It's got good enough go for an engine of this kind. But yes, it's probably not as much fun as the older Italian cars used to be, but then that didn't really help them to sell cars back in the day. So I'm not sure why that would hold it back necessarily. I don't think many people buying a car of this type are going to be interested in how it drives at the limit. The gearbox is a bit of a highlight actually. It's a 6-speeder, it's light, it's crisp, it's not overly long in the throw. It's a shame really that the steering and the engine don't tally up, because I think that would have really helped to lift the car. The other thing is, in terms of the interior, so these were very cheap cars and they had to save that money somewhere. Standard equipment is actually pretty good. This has cruise control, it has air conditioning, it has a few other gadgets and so on that come with cars of this age. Obviously it doesn't have an Apple radio or anything like that, but you know, in terms of standard equipment, it's really not that bad. The plastics do come across as quite cheap. This little dash pad isn't too bad, apart from being shiny, but it is soft touch. But the door sides, the way it's laid out, it's not particularly interesting. The instruments at least do look pretty nice. I think they've got some nice sort of graphics on them, a nice start-up procedure. So maybe the materials could have been a little bit better, but in other ways, it's quite a refined car. So noise suppression is good. It's quite quiet at cruising speeds. There's not much tire noise that comes through into the cabin. The driving position is pretty good. Ergonomics are all pretty sensible. There's no sort of buttons shoved all over the place or anything like that. Perhaps the switches for the windows are a little bit further forward than you would like, but it's a really very minor thing. All in all, it's a very competent car. So what's the problem? Well, I think that it's almost a car that came too late in Fiat's life. If this had come maybe 10, 15 years earlier, it would have been more successful. I think that the issue is that it used to be that Fiat made cars that were fun to drive, or more fun to drive than other manufacturers. And they traded that against the quality and reliability issues. But I think that since then, other manufacturers have caught up. So maybe Fiat made something that was competent, lacked pizzazz, but was competent. But in the meantime, the others came up with cars that had all that, but are also a little bit better to drive. Now, James averages about 54 miles to the gallon in this. It's been perfectly reliable in the 3.5 years that he's owned it. He's paid so little for it. I think it is an absolute bargain, and I think it's a very, very confident car. It's a very competent car, but does it deserve to have done better than it has? Well, I think it does in some ways. I mean, Dacia has been quite successful with its own cars. I don't understand why Fiat hasn't been more successful with this. They could have engineered a bit more fun into it, but I'm not sure that that would have really necessarily helped. I think there is still some sort of underlying problem with Fiat's, you know, selling larger cars. They sort of do all right with the Pandas, with the 500s, but whenever it's anything larger, they always seem to struggle. Now, interestingly, this is the best-selling car in Turkey, which is quite a strange accolade. Partly, I think that is explained because it is built in a factory jointly owned by Fiat and a Turkish manufacturer in Turkey. But it obviously seems to work pretty well over there as the best-selling car. Even in Italy, though, James has been there recently, I went as well. I haven't seen many of these, and Fiat used to sell almost everything it made over there. So, a bit baffling overall. The buzzy engine and the iffy steering really are a shame, because I think apart from that, the Tipo is a really pretty good car. Thank you for watching what was quite an unusual number 27 video, but I was eager to sample one of Fiat's more modern offerings. Thank you, and see you for the next one.